Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Lucky Penney. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. So during the Cold War, all eyes faced north. A menacing Soviet attack could have come at any moment across the North Pole, and a growing Soviet nuclear arsenal threatened North America, so America prepared by partnering closely with Canada and forming the North American Air Defense Command, or NORAD. So this binational command focused on deterring and, if required, defending from attack. The U.S. Air Force was front and center, operating air defense radars and sitting strip alert in what was once called Air Defense Command. General Billy Mitchell recognized the Arctic's importance by saying, "Whoever holds Alaska will hold the world." And for most of the 20th century, the Air Force emphasized homeland defense. But by the turn of this century, after 9/11, that was no longer the case. But now, with Iraq and Afghanistan largely in the rearview mirror, America and the Air Force finds itself coming full circle to the northern circle. Modern airborne threats, cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, long-range drones, these all threaten our homeland and have the potential of attack through the Arctic. It remains the most direct path between our adversaries and us. But after years of atrophy, our existing radars and defense systems are no longer adequate. Former NORAD commander General Glenn Van Herk has characterized the existing radar system like a picket fence where missiles can avoid detection and threaten the U.S. without warning. Existing radar systems are unable to detect more modern threats. And making things even worse are the information stovepipes between the United States and our European allies. Even if NATO becomes aware of threats that are approaching the United States, secure communications between headquarters are challenging, to say the least. Simply put, insufficient Arctic domain awareness leaves Americans vulnerable. To discuss the Arctic's ties to Golden Dome and how to improve Arctic domain awareness. So we've got three experts. First, retired Major General Pete Coach Fesler. Coach, great to have you on board.
Good to be here. Thanks, Lucky. Looking forward to the discussion.
So Coach is a former Air Force F-22 pilot, and he last served as NORAD's Deputy Director for Operations in Colorado Springs. And in his current capacity, he continues to consult extensively on Homeland Defense. Second, we've got retired Brigadier General Houston Slider Cantwell, our Senior Resident Fellow here at the Mitchell Institute. He recently retired from the Air Force after a 30-year career flying F-16s and MQ-9s and other remotely piloted aircraft, and is currently wrapping up an Arctic domain awareness research project. Slider, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Lucky. Great to be here.
And finally, I know everyone's going to be excited about this, we've got Major General Larry Stutzriem. Stutz, as you remember, is a former Director of Studies and Research at the Mitchell Institute, and now he's Air and Space Force's Executive Vice President. Stutz also has extensive NORAD experience, and he retired as NORAD's Director of Plans, Policy, and Strategy. Stutz, welcome back.
Thank you, Lucky. This is a topic near and dear to my heart, and I'm just on the hallway. I'm not coming back. I've always been here.
Okay, thank you. So, Slider, help us set the stage for this discussion. Why is Arctic domain awareness so important, and what are some of the key issues on the table?
Yeah, Lucky. We'll start off. Some historical context, I think, would be important. Back in the 1950s, as you think about the Cold War, it's heating up. The United States took this threat very seriously, dedicated tremendous efforts for our defense. I think for the first time, America was acknowledging that the natural boundaries, the Pacific, the Atlantic Oceans, were insufficient barriers at this point.
Oh, yeah.
And so this resulted in the creation of NORAD in 1957. And then an aggressive investment in domain awareness systems. So we had this binational relationship with NORAD, and then we had to invest in the sensors and the radars to be able to have situational awareness.
Pine Tree, all the picket ships, working with Canada. We had the SAGE system to do all the command and control for ADC, Air Defense Command, all those cone heads.
Multiple lines.
Oh, yeah.
Tremendous investment across Canada to warn of an impending Soviet nuclear attack. But then over the years, the U.S. national security shifted. Following the Cold War, we shifted to the global war on terror. But I think we can all agree the new administration has a renewed homeland defense focus. When you look squarely at the Arctic, the continued global warming is fundamentally changing the landscape, increasing access to natural gas, minerals, fishing, trade routes, all highlighting the increasing strategic value of the Arctic. And we've all heard the POTUS interest in Canada and Greenland for these very reasons.
Yeah.
But none of this changes the fact that years of neglect and lack of priority have resulted in a sort of regional atrophy. The domain awareness systems, the radars, they remain outdated. They're unable to detect the modern threats. So the systems used to quickly pass information intelligence, they're also outdated. And so all combining to form an unacceptable vulnerability, given that these new advanced long-range conventional missiles are capable of holding so many of our U.S. strategic interests at risk.
Yeah, so the Arctic Circle, we've got legacy systems that really are insufficient to be able to detect, warn, and then respond to the modern threats from China, from Russia, at the same time that we're seeing that region's important strategically, both from a geopolitical standpoint, but from a resource and economic standpoint, grow. And Russia and China certainly understand the Arctic strategic importance. So what have we been seeing up there, and why does it matter? What are they doing?
They have seen this, and General Brown, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he recognized, and NORAD commanders have recognized in testimony to Congress, all commenting on the increased Russian and Chinese Arctic activities. Mm-hmm. We've seen commercial, scientific, military activities all on the rise. Our Coast Guard Commandant reported a marked increase in Chinese research vessels in 2024.
Research, air quotes,
research exactly. They are research vessels. The PRC, they're projecting naval surface warships into the Bering Sea off of Alaska for 4 years in a row. This is something that they don't traditionally do. So we're seeing this increased military activity.
Yeah.
And then most recently, we saw the Chinese deployed a bomber aircraft to a Russian airfield just last year, and they formed a joint Russian-Chinese bomber task force that then flew combined into the Alaskan Air Defense Identification Zone.
Yeah.
I mean, truly things we've never seen before. They were testing us.
Right. And to be fair, at this point, I mean, we don't think that Russia and China have the ability to conduct integrated coalition operations, but this is baby steps. Their intention is markedly clear, as well as their alliance.
Yeah, Lucky, I'd also like to say, just to add to that, is the Russians not only recognized it, but they took action well before how we feel today about needing to take action on the U.S. side of this. So they are well ahead in posturing themselves to fight and win in the Arctic and to control the Arctic sea lanes.
I really don't think that most understand the threat posed by Russia and China to us here in the homeland. I think most understand the nuclear threat, but the Kremlin in particular has been pretty open about their intent to strike targets here in North America in the event of conflict in Europe. In the early 21st century, they kind of woke up from their post-Cold War malaise and they started to consider war with the West again. And they realized they were outmatched when faced with a fully mobilized NATO. They pretty much faced a choice. They could either build a military to compete in a force-on-force battle, or they could keep NATO from mobilizing. Specifically, they could keep the U.S. from getting to NATO to be able to mobilize in the European theater. And they chose the second option, keep the U.S. out of the fight, do that through influence operations, and if necessary, through military force. And if you follow their money over the last 20 years or so, the Kremlin invested pretty heavily in three major areas. Nuclear force modernization, let's keep a lid on the conflict and prevent nuclear escalation. They invested in air defense to stop the devastating air attacks that they've witnessed us execute in every major conflict since Desert Storm. And the third thing they invested in is the ability to conduct ultra-long-range non-nuclear strikes. They invested in long-range stealthy cruise missiles capable of ranging the U.S. and Canada, and they invested in the submarines and bombers to deliver them. They intend to keep us out of that fight, or at least delay us by crippling our infrastructure. Beijing, a little bit more opaque on its intent. It hasn't been so overt about what it's trying to do, but it appears to be on a pretty similar path. And that should concern us.
And this is really important, Coach, what you brought up about the Homeland Defense holdback, right? That's really what you're getting at, because if for some reason our homeland had a kinetic attack on it, we would suddenly be mobilizing all of our forces to do nothing but just protect the homeland. And given where we're at within the Air Force capacity, we don't have enough aircraft, whether that's fighters, bombers, mobility, and any of the other special use aircraft like the E-3, AWACS, tankers. We don't have enough to be able to continue to project power in defense of our allies and partnership there, and also do Homeland. So that would really decrease our power projection capability. And so this really makes it troubling because we have not focused on Homeland defense. Since 9/11, the focus has really been overseas and the projection of offensive military might. So you might see it across the department regarding future military capabilities and investment priorities in defending our nation. Certainly our desire is to fight overseas and make the fight away. But in the future, that decision might not be ours.
That's exactly right. I mean, the enemy gets a vote. We've all heard this through the course of our careers. The enemy, in this case, our adversaries, arrived at the same conclusion they did. They want to fight us here instead of in their own backyard. If you think about it, we put on a clinic over the last 35 years on how we fight. We deploy forward, we build up an overwhelming force in a theater, and then we attack by air at a time and place of our choosing. Beijing decided they're not going to let us even find bases in the Western Pacific, and both the Kremlin and Beijing have decided they'd like to not let us leave our bases here at home. As I said, we watched them both develop those strategies and build the forces necessary to conduct those strategies. Meanwhile, we continue to build a force for the fight to fight the war that we want instead of the fight that's coming. I think most Americans would be surprised to know how little we actually have to defend ourselves here at home. One retired four-star who will remain nameless put it, we've become the Department of Offense. What we need is a force that can both defend and attack at the same time. In my opinion, we can't rely solely on the offensive capability.
I completely agree with you. If we want to have the ability to fight away and do that offensive play, what we need to do first is ensure that no one can get to the homeland.
The United States is a force projection platform. It's where all of our stuff is. We need a secure homeland to deploy from if we want to fight that forward fight.
Amen. So one organization designed from the ground up, focused on defense, is NORAD, right? From day one, its intent was to deter and defeat the Soviet threat. But now we face both a Russian and a Chinese threat. So, Stutz, bringing you back to the conversation, given your experience at NORAD, can you give us some insights into the importance of that binational command with Canada and its role in deterring and defending from attack?
Yeah, let me begin by kind of tying into what Coach said. Is we use the term existential very loosely today. It's almost hyperbole.
Yeah.
There is truly only one existential threat to the United States, and that's a mass nuclear strike on our mainland. And that was understood in the Cold War. And so you had out of that North American Defense Agreement that Slider talked about, you had the advent of NORAD. And to get your head around how they see this is they look at the world completely differently from everybody else. They look at it from the top down. And when you take the globe and you look at it that way, you get it. It's the shortest distance for missiles or cruise missiles if they're launched off bombers or from the land. It's a zone of least detection. And that least detection means a lack of decision time for us to posture, to demarche, to check the aims of an adversary. So talking about this command, which is just an amazing thing that needs tremendous resourcing, putting together this command way back, just think about it, 2 nations, one big, one small. There were sovereignty concerns. There was capability, asymmetry between the forces they had. There were different understandings of the threat. There were policies and laws that were different. There were political and public opinions that were very disparate at the time. And then the speed at which these 2 nations moved was very different. So they did get this together. They put it together. And the result was we have shared burden on this notion of defending, or this important thing of defending North America. There's burden sharing in terms of money. Canada's committed $40 billion in the next 20 years.
That's not chump change.
It's not chump change. So they have enhanced continental security. It's deep in trust. It's one of the slickest operations in terms of our coordination because despite things like tariffs and migration issues that are different between the 2 countries, The command itself is very well greased and has matured over the years. So I think that really says that relevance today still exists. It's still the existential threat, but the importance of its resourcing and filling capability gaps now is a priority.
I want to get back to what you mentioned, that obviously the shortest path is over the poles, so over the Arctic Circle. Clearly, Canada is the first part of that. And I think people might be shocked to find that we don't really have the situational awareness coverage, that detection capability over the poles. We don't have the satellite capability because those are very difficult and rare orbits. And people might even be surprised that we don't do routine satellite coverage of the North Atlantic, for example. So if you're flying commercially across the North Atlantic, commercial airliners are still making radio position reports on HF frequencies.
Yeah.
So the situational awareness, that detection capability, really is crucial to defending our nations. And that's our nations. That's multiple. It's not just the US, it's being able to defend Canada as well. But those are not the only nations that are in the Arctic. We've got NATO Arctic nations as well. So is the binational relationship with Canada sufficient? I would argue we probably need to expand that if we're really going to be serious about Arctic defense.
Yeah, I would say certainly not sufficient, but foundational. That relationship is absolutely foundational, but not sufficient. There's plenty of opportunity here, and we've gained so much through our NATO alliance, and this is one example of that. Whether it's shared intelligence, look at Finland, now having them as part of the alliance, sharing nearly 1,000-mile border with Russia. You think they've had some situational awareness on what Russian military activities are in the Arctic Circle?
They can contribute something good.
Are you kidding me?
Right.
Oh my gosh. I mean, it must be unreal, the amount of the fidelity of information they have, both maritime as well as land and air. And then you've got NATO countries bringing tremendous capabilities. They currently fly the AWACS. Several of the countries are purchasing future variants of the MQ-9. NATO is slated to buy the future E-7 Wedgetail. And so these capabilities all can contribute to domain awareness across the Arctic without the United States providing those kinds of capabilities. But certainly one of the biggest challenges is going to have to be information sharing. The lack of systems that can directly communicate.
Machine to machine.
Machine to machine, exactly. And then the lack of NORAD, NATO military exercises. Coach, I don't know how much experience you had when you were on the staff, but when I've spoken to staff members on either side of the Atlantic, whether it was Kayak-Udom or whether it was at NORAD, there just aren't those direct touch points between NATO and NORAD that are breaking down some of those barriers that can be just enough barrier for situational awareness and just enough of a barrier to prohibit timely decision making.
And it's really all about
Yeah, it's
time.
interesting. If I could make a quick point there, to answer your question, not very often. It was a handful of exercises over my entire time at NORAD, between NORAD and NATO, focused mostly on handing off a single aircraft, if you will, a single hijacked aircraft from one command to the other. I think something that's lost on a lot of people is both partners in NORAD are NATO. NATO and NORAD should be one and the same.
Yeah.
I was
Well
actually
said.
just thinking about that because, we've focused all of our NATO activities on the Fulda Gap, but in reality, something happening to Canada or the United States is also Article 5 triggering.
Yeah, that's true. The other piece of this, we have a lot of visitors that come from NATO nations hosted here at Mitchell, and they are awakened by what's happening with Russia right now.
Yeah,
and
they are.
they ask us a lot of questions about how is this going to happen. There is a hunger, and they do have tremendous capabilities, especially in the maritime domain, where they are very focused, and that's an important also part of the overall Arctic domain awareness that NORAD needs.
Yeah, we used to have the picket ships as part of the North American air defense. I'm not really sure what the status of that is now, or do we even have them?
I don't know.
I don't believe so.
Probably
I don't
not.
think so. Yeah. Which gets to this overall notion of domain awareness, right? One of the biggest frustrations I think we've all articulated is the lack of domain awareness for Arctic security. Because the radars, sliders you talked about, they're antiquated or they're not existent. C2 networks have atrophied. So, Slider, can you share more about this critical vulnerability? Because if you can't see it, if you don't know it's there, you can't make decisions and you can't act.
Yeah, so the main system is called the North Warning System, and that was the row of radars that are across Canada providing awareness for those threats coming in. Unfortunately, those radars have not been updated since the 1980s. And as we all know, the threats have changed tremendously since the 1980s. So they're insufficient. Now, the good news is that Canada and the United States are moving out on a replacement, but there's not a whole lot of urgency behind this new project. And then additionally, you've got the U.S. flying the AWACS. And then officially, when you look at the Air Force budget, there actually is no replacement for the AWACS at this particular moment, which we'll discuss more later. But that's a huge vulnerability that we've got to try to mitigate.
Putting all our eggs into one basket for AMTI, and we're totally focused on China, which means we're not going to get the right P-LEO orbits to be able to monitor what's going on over the Arctic.
Right.
I mean, it just seems to me that not supporting and pursuing E7 as fast as we possibly can is just a huge mistake. What's the name of the radar system that should be replacing, that you were just talking about?
Over the horizon radar.
Over the horizon? Okay, yeah.
And that's on the books, but it's a long-term, very expensive, and Canada has committed billions of dollars to that.
And there's been some money taken out over the years. It's been planned, some money taken out of the program. So it's slowed down quite a bit.
Yep.
You know, and that's unfortunate because the more you slow down a program, the more it's going to cost. And then you get behind technologically. So you get behind the modernization and what adversaries are doing to be able to counter those capabilities. There's just nothing good about slowing down an acquisition program.
But there is a good news out there.
Oh my God,
and
give us some.
I want to give you a little good news.
Okay, give us some hope.
And so Israel showed us how it could be done. So if you look at their layered defense systems that they've got, had tremendous success just last year in both April and October of 2024, where their layered radar systems were able to acquire, track, and provide that defensive network that was required. And they stopped hundreds of inbound missiles and projectiles on 2 separate occasions. But it was foundationally, if they hadn't had those radar systems in place, the very modern ones that they have, it never would have happened.
Okay, so Coach, we've done a lot of worry beads here. How do we move forward? And what, if you're going to be making your Christmas list of Santa Claus, what are the systems upgrades that you see as essential?
That's a great question. Let me start with framing it a little bit, or framing the question a little bit, to say, in order to get domain awareness in the Arctic, we need to be able to detect, track, and identify things from the seafloor all the way up to on orbit.
Okay.
In an integrated air and missile defense side, that's from a low altitude subsonic cruise missile down at a couple hundred feet, traditional aircraft in the 20s or 30s, hypersonic cruise missiles up maybe at around 100,000, hypersonic glide at 250,000 feet, all the way up to ballistic missiles that are topping out at maybe 2,500 nautical miles above the surface. That's a pretty broad area to cover vertically. And then you have that entire front, which, by the way, is roughly double the front from the Philippines to Korea, roughly double the front to get from the Aleutians around the pole, around the North American Arctic, around to Canada and Greenland. 3,500 mile front.
Wow.
So in order to be able to do that, I think you've got to have a combination of different sensors, a layered approach to this. Space sensors can cover a pretty wide area. To your point right now, though, we don't have enough coverage with the space sensors, but we're getting there. They're good, and they're getting even better at tracking some, but not all of the threats. They're particularly good at high and hot targets, like a hypersonic glide vehicle, hypersonic cruise missile. Not good at some of the other ones that are out there. So space sensors can solve some of it, but we're going to need ground-based sensors. The over-the-horizon radar that Slider mentioned and Stutz talked to is certainly a key component of that. And I'll come back to that in just a second. But right now we have other things that are out there that do provide sensor data, and simply integrating that data into command and control systems can help plug some of the gaps. FAA radars, for example, or NAV Canada radars can see low radar cross-section threats, but it's filtered out today based on the poor computing power behind those old radars.
Are you serious?
So if we put new processing power behind radars and we bring them into command and control system, we can start to see some of those smaller and lower altitude targets that are out there. Then we bring in that over-the-horizon radar that was mentioned. Very long ranges, 2,500 plus nautical mile detection. They can look at things all the way down from those low altitude subsonic cruise missiles all the way up to the higher altitude things. They can contribute to space domain awareness and maritime surface domain awareness as well. But OTHR doesn't have the accuracy to be able to provide a cue that is tight enough to shoot a weapon against it. So they're really a surveillance type radar. The track is good enough to get somebody else with a fire control radar or a airborne early warning platform there to put a radar on it, to be able to generate that fire control quality cue, to be able to actually do something about the threat, which in my mind leads to the third part of this layered defense, which is the airborne portion of the layer. There's absolutely a role for airborne early warning in defense of North America. It's highly accurate, and it can provide command and control as well. But I think more importantly, it provides flexibility. Airborne platforms can move to cover gaps. They can move to cover higher priority areas. And equally important, if we transition from defense to offense, or we find ourselves in a different type of conflict, it provides the flexibility to go forward and fight whatever fight we find ourselves in. In my opinion, we need a combination of space-based, ground-based, and airborne sensors to achieve Arctic domain awareness. But interestingly enough, the real challenge with domain awareness hasn't been technical. It's just the fact that we haven't invested in it in the last 50 years.
Well said.
Yeah. So Stutz, talking about that airborne layer, and Coach, I loved how you articulated that it's a need for all of them, that it's that layered situational awareness that is going to be essential to being able to provide Arctic security. And also how you discussed the airborne layer being a way to be able to concentrate capability, shift capability, and also, frankly, is that surge force to then move forward and into the offense. So Stutz, you had authored a research study a while ago, and we'll include this in the show notes, focused on the applicability of unmanned aircraft, the MQ-9, to future national security challenges. So how do you see systems like this contributing?
Well, first, I want to apologize to Slider because that paper just labels me as an MQ-9 guy, and I'm a fighter pilot. Fear and perfect.
That's right. You haven't earned the
I know
title
the
of
mantle.
MQ-9
The mantle.
pilot.
I wrote a paper.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think all of us at this table, Lucky, Slider, and Coach, I consider myself a fight tonight guy. And one of the frustrations I had when I was at Northcom about probably more than a decade before Coach was there was everything was leaning into the future, what we needed to do to get these capabilities. And today we are still talking about the same issues. Filling the gaps are what is important right now. So, okay, let's say magically everything's funded that we would love to see NORAD have. It's going to take a long time. We have to fill these gaps. And so when I looked at the MQ-9, at that time, the Air Force was first talking about retiring the entire fleet. It just seemed incredibly short-sighted to not see that this very cheap cost per hour flying hour platform that can operate at medium altitude where you can see very long distances, which is unmanned, so you don't put people at risk, that it was kind of being cast aside as irrelevant. And in that paper, we talk about a lot of areas on the planet and operational situations where it could be valuable. Podding capability is very popular right now, and so the MQ-9 can be podded to do a lot of different types of missions very quickly too, especially with the latest variation, the B model, which has got even more endurance. And that endurance is a big piece of this. So what can happen with the MQ-9 or other platforms like it is that it can follow the demos, which have shown its ability to communicate and fly and operate very high in the Arctic zone. But when you think about networking a number of these together using very basic AI, not sophisticated AI we talk about all the time, you begin to kind of see you can fill an atmospheric gap. And it's a very dynamic. Up in North Dakota right now, they're working with the Test Resource Management Center. And Houston, you know more about this, but they are looking to take these Global Hawks that are sitting up there and use them on a cooperative basis with the TRMC to do some looks where there is increased risk, increased operational vigilance. And I know, Houston, you've been up there recently. Maybe you can talk a little bit more to that.
Yeah, they've got MQ-9s there as well.
Yeah.
So it's a combined fleet of 4s and 9s. And I found it interesting that they'll be setting up a hypersonic test range. That's what they're trying to set up. So instead of having a bunch of ships that are in place for thousands of miles, they'll just fly a bunch of aircraft out there and clean out and monitor as the hypersonic missiles are flying through the range. One thing I looked into was that we actually have ground-based missile radars out in the Pacific, and some of those are also used for missile tests to gather all the data on the tests. And they're actually dual-use radars, where the radars are sometimes used for missile test and sometimes used for actual domain awareness. And I think that a very similar concept could be used here for those TRMC assets.
Yeah, I thought one of the other operational advantages, and we talked about this before, Slider, that the way the test community is setting this up is that this whole design is very flexible. It can move west, it can move east on a dot. It's not projecting from a fixed base. So if you think about its use in air surveillance of the Arctic or maritime surveillance over the coast, heightened risk, heightened vigilance, there's some tipper out there, you can immediately get, but it's about the gap filling. What are we going to do in the next 10 years or 15 years or 5 years? We got to be ready to fight tonight. So we got to get serious about that.
Which I'm really interested to dig more, Coach, if you can, about the notion of integrating the data that exists today. So Stutz, Slider, you guys were talking about using MQ-9s and MQ-4s. And the cool thing about the B model, it's got enhanced range. It's also all weather. It's got anti-ice capability. But the data that exists in FAA radars and the data exists in these dual capable ground radars, what can we do right now to knit that together and fuse that to enhance our domain awareness today?
Yeah, that's something that we've been staring at for a while. In fact, CDAO right now, the Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office at the Pentagon, has been trying to help figure this thing out. How do we mesh together all of the data from all of these disparate sources to try to create a composite picture? The challenge that we face is we still live in a world where we buy individual systems to address individual problems, and they have proprietary solutions to addressing those problems. So a lot of the systems don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
So one is being able to get systems to talk to each other, and the other part is being able to unlock the data by applying advanced algorithms, advanced computing, artificial intelligence, et cetera, to be able to understand what information is in that data and turn it into something that's usable. I think we're getting close on that. We're making some good progress, and there have been some tests over the last 4 or 5 years that have really shown an ability to pull tracks out of what in the past would have been data that was just thrown away. This is just clutter. It's not of value, but the tracks are actually in there.
Wow.
Yeah, let me pile onto that real quick. I think the project that you're talking about there, Coach, is Project Maven, algorithmic warfare cross-functional team. It's unbelievable what they've been able to come up with, again, using artificial intelligence to dig data that once would have been just thrown away. But I want to go back to the integration of all the different systems, because in my research, chatting with former Northcom commanders, the Chinese balloon in 2023, that's a perfect example of how the information somehow fell through the cracks between, in this case, it was PACOM and Northcom, where Northcom was given, I think it was less than 24 hours notice, that this balloon that had been tracked for days across the Pacific is now about to enter the Northcom AOR. And that's just a fundamental breakdown in the transfer of information on a very slow moving target. And so
40 knots.
Yeah, 40 knots. But General Van Herk, I thought one of the greatest initiatives that he came up with were the guide exercises, the global information dominance experiments. Those guide experiments were absolutely tremendous in terms of getting COCOMs to have common databases, common operating pictures, to be able to have shared domain awareness and eventually information dominance. And now, since then, Northcom's no longer running the guide experiments. That's been moved on to what you just talked about, Coach, which is the CDAO office. But the good news is those are continuing and continuing to break down those stovepipes that still exist and will probably always exist until we've got the sentient AI system out there that runs the United States or runs the world.
Skynet.
The Skynet. But those barriers have got to be continued to try to be broken down.
If I could jump in, Coach, you'd appreciate this. Back in, I think it was 2009, so at NORAD, Coach, we had a boat that was coming out, I believe it was Taiwan, and there was some intel that there were bad people on this boat. A boat. It was a slow-moving boat. And between PACOM and Northcom, we lost the target, we gained the target. projections of where it was going, trying to fuse. And it came down to the lack of fusion of what everybody knew across government, across commands. That's 2009. We're still talking about this stuff today. So when our leadership puts as the top defense priority the defense of the homeland, we're certainly not serious about it, getting those resources and those capabilities in place to protect the homeland. So it's kind of a wake-up call that we're still in the same kind of place that we were decades ago.
Gosh, 35 knots, maritime target, and you start out with positive target ID in custody, and you're dropping it and having, what a hot mess. What a hot mess.
Yeah. Think about when it's a Mach 15 target.
There you go.
Exactly.
And you have seconds to take a shot, and that first shot might be out of Indo-PACOM, and the second shot is out of an Alaska-based force, and the third shot is out of something in the Northwest U.S. or Canada. Boy, we're not going to have time to do the sorts of things that we've been doing with ships and with balloons.
There you go.
Yeah, we got to get serious. So we're using artificial intelligence to try to begin to break down heterogeneous data and break into those proprietary systems so we can do that kind of fusion, so we can handle these hypersonic, these Mach 15 types of targets. But that's not the only thing that I think it obstructs us from being able to integrate across the combatant commands, and that's classification. Whether or not that's classification within U.S. systems, classification across U.S. systems, but certainly when you begin to integrate our NORAD and NATO partners, that becomes even thornier.
Yeah, that's something that's been a challenge for some time. It continues to be a challenge today. If you think about defense of the North American continent, that really starts forward. The first country to be able to be in a position to intercept a bomber taking off out of the western district of Russia is probably Norway, maybe Finland. If it's a cruise missile launched from in the Norwegian Sea, it's going to fly across Greenland on its way to targets in Canada or the eastern United States. If a Chinese bomber takes off out of China on its way to Alaska, it's going to cross through Japanese airspace on the way. So we need to be able to share data with our allies and partners. We're not good at that today. We have unnecessary classification restrictions. I joke about this all the time. We had multiple Royal Air Force exchange pilots in the F-22, and we told them everything about the jet, vulnerabilities, capabilities, how the systems worked. But we couldn't share information with them about the SA-2s that we got in the 1960s.
That's crazy.
Because they were marked no form.
Oh my God.
We've got to solve this policy problem. In my mind, there are very few things that should be kept from our closest allies, and we've got to solve that in order to be able to successfully defend North America.
I saw an RAF pilot with one of those Friday morale patches, and it said, "Yes, foreign."
Nice.
Yeah.
We know that we are going to have to fight together. We need to start being realistic about that when it comes to our classification and our policies.
Right.
So speaking about fighting together, our NATO allies, they are on program to get the E-7 Wedgetail already down in Australia. We've sent some air battle managers down there to fly on the E-7. But there's a lot of talk right now surrounding the future of E-7. We know that Congress right now has said, thou shalt stay on program with the E-7. But the Air Force has wavered, and they are looking to cancel any future buys. So what, from your view, do you see the Wedgetail playing regarding its role in Arctic domain awareness?
Yeah, I think that it fits squarely into that framework that Coach so eloquently walked us through in terms of being that flexible. If we actually do get into some kind of campaign, we can expect our ground and our space systems to come under attack.
Yeah.
They're going to be degraded in some way. And once they're degraded, how do you respond? The way you respond is, well, you get engineers out there to try to fix those systems. But in the meantime, you can send your airborne assets out there to plug the gaps and to make sure that you have some level of coverage when those other systems are degraded. I think it's absolutely important that the E-7 also be recognized that it's a very important intermediate C2 node.
Yeah.
You've got air battle managers on there as an intermediate decision maker and able to actually vector response if that becomes necessary, especially when other communication networks are broken down and some of those C2 networks aren't providing the level of capability that we would expect. The AWACS can fill those gaps as well.
That's a really crucial point. The E7 isn't simply about sensing. It is battle management and command and control. And that's something that I don't think we really appreciate as much as we should, is the resilience that provides, especially in contested environments. And we have to assume that in any future conflict, the Arctic domain is going to be one of the first that will be contested.
Yeah, and the good news is that NATO and the UK are currently in negotiations with Boeing. So they're working on a contract, but I think it'd be an ideal option for Canada as well.
Well said.
On that command and control point,
Yeah.
the last 4 commanders of NORAD and NORTHCOM have talked about going after the Archer instead of the Arrow. Let's not have a bunch of goalies. Let's go out there and go get the bombers at range.
Yep.
If you think about going after a bomber outside of the range at which it can launch a very long-range cruise missile, you're talking about operating hundreds of miles north of the most northern part of the Canadian archipelago. And in the way that it works today, if you send them out there without airborne early warning and that command and control that it provides, it is not much different than a 17th century ship. Go forth and harass the Spanish. Let us know how it goes when you get back. We ought to be able to do better than that.
And not only should we ought to be able to do better than that, we will need to be able to do better than that, given where we're seeing Russian and Chinese capabilities going, the number of missiles that they will be able to carry. We will need to synchronize and prioritize what our effects so that we can more effectively protect our homeland. You talked about the layered role for domain awareness, and so space is going to be part of that. Space-based GMTI and AMTI have been promised for a long time. Where are we with those emerging technologies?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's
that's not what we expected you to answer.
Yeah.
Good question.
But the fact of the matter is, this has been something that's been promised for some time. And I'm going to tell you right now that space-based surveillance is improving significantly. We can see a lot more from on orbit than we ever could before. But it still can't do everything. There are still some pretty notable capability gaps. And because they're technological challenges, our adversaries know where those gaps are. They face the same physics problems that we do. So they develop systems to exploit those gaps in coverage. So we can't rely entirely on a space-based technology. But I'll tell you, I think equally important, do we really want to put all of our eggs in one basket?
Yeah.
There was a time when we had exclusive use of space, but I think it's safe to say that's no longer the case. We are not going to be able to operate on orbit with impunity. And personally, I want redundancy and a layered approach, like I talked about, space-based, ground-based, and airborne, to be able to provide a redundant and resilient sensor grid that can detect the full range of threats that we face.
I completely agree. And as you mentioned, our ability to sense from space is dramatically improving, but it's still not there. It certainly hasn't been fielded. It's not operational. It's not something that can provide information directly into a cockpit. But more importantly, the whole notion that P-LEO is a deterrent and would dissuade an adversary from targeting those constellations, I think is a non-starter, because if we were to put all of our eggs in one basket in a P-LEO, that's not going to stop the adversary from going, hey, that's a high-value target. If they were to kill those constellations and they could completely blind the United States, that they might have to deal with some of the unintended consequences for themselves as well, given their own space assets. But it certainly isn't going to stop them from targeting our most valuable and foundational element of our domain awareness. Because if they can kill our domain awareness, we're blind and then we're paralyzed, and they know that. So P-LEO is not going to be some kind of deterrent capability. It's meant to be resilient through the numbers. But again, if that constellation then goes down, or even just that part of that constellation goes down, you still have gaps and you need to have that layered capability.
But Lucky, I think it's also important to point out that not only is space about the sensing, but it's also about the communications capabilities that it provides to the Arctic. Coach mentioned earlier, there's not a lot once you get north of about 150 miles of the U.S.-Canada border. It gets very desolate. There are not a lot of communication nodes, and so space is allowing some of that command and control. It's allowing that communications to continue to move across the Arctic when it counts.
It's important to note that those are not our primary U.S. Orbits. We don't really do that super often. We see Russia doing a lot more of those eccentric orbits, those polar orbits.
Right.
So we might need to invest a little bit more in that to be able to ensure that those capabilities continue to exist.
Certainly in that. And I also want to give a shout out to the Space Development Agency, because they have been doing just tremendous work in terms of bringing the proliferated warfighter space architecture to reality. And those capabilities are going to be very important for both data relay, missile warning, and tracking capabilities.
Yeah, I don't want anyone to think that I'm anti-space. I'm just saying it can't be the only thing that we have.
For sure.
And that's one of the major challenges, I think, is people are looking at space and air as either or, but it needs to be both and.
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about Golden Dome, or at least I've alluded to it, so I want to just bring that to the forefront. What are the ties that are important to that effort within NORAD, our NATO countries, and all of the technologies and capabilities we've talked about today?
Yeah, so domain awareness, that's going to be absolutely foundational to missile defense. And General Gutlein, he's got 60 days to come up with his objective architecture. I think he's got about 45 days left, so that clock's going pretty fast. He's emphasized his desire to use proven technologies. He doesn't want science experiments as he's moving forward. And his first priority is building a robust joint all-domain command and control system. In fact, last week he was quoted as saying, "We have to bring to bear an integrated network of sensors to be able to close the fire control loop with an integrated network of interceptors." Lots of important work on incorporating a maximum number of radars and passive sensors into the NORAD common operating picture.
So is he doing this data integration that Coach was talking about earlier?
It's
Step
on his
one.
list of things to do. I don't see how he does that very rapidly, given that so many organizations have focused on that fundamental challenge for so many years. But knowing that he's going to put that on his list, I think is absolutely critical.
Well, that's hopeful. And with the attention of the president, I mean, Golden Dome is one of his babies. Hopefully that can kickstart not just the funding and the focus, but also break down a lot of those barriers to include the classification of the stovepiping.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's also important to point out that for years, Canada has had a policy where they are not going to participate in a missile defense shield like what we've had up until now. They've recently changed that policy. And so we'll see how that affects the binational relationship. We'll see how that affects our relationship moving forward. I think it's going to be all goodness, but that's certainly an important change to highlight.
Yeah, I'm sure Stutz has an opinion on this as well. But, I think this change is getting relatively little press inside the U.S., but it is a significant change. First, from an operational standpoint, we need Canada involved in Golden Dome, and that shift in policy inside of Canada is going to allow them to fully participate. The reason we need them is we need Canadian terrain in the high north to be able to defend the United States. Interestingly enough, Ottawa needs the United States to help defend the Canadian population and infrastructure, which is mostly along the U.S.-Canadian border. This was a primary reason for why NORAD was formed 67 years ago, and it still applies today. The second thing I wanted to point out on this is when Canada opted out of ballistic missile defense, that BMD mission was placed under U.S. Northern Command. All the other air and missile defense tasks are under NORAD. And it creates this awkward kind of carve out in integrated air and missile defense, opening up gaps in command and control seams. And it's really inefficient. So with Canada opting into that missile defense mission, that can be moved back under NORAD, closing those gaps and seams and forming a single command responsible for all integrated air and missile defense. It's going to take a little bit of work. We're going to have to go back into the terms of reference between the United States and Canada for NORAD. But the structure is sound and the basic principles of the agreement remain intact. And ultimately, I see this strengthening the U.S. and Canadian defense relationship.
Yeah. Golden Dome is certainly going to have a direct effect on Arctic security. I mean, we think about Golden Dome as this big bubble that just, goes from sea to shining sea. And in reality, it's going to be very different. But it's clear that the focus is going to have to be looking towards the north because that's where a huge piece of the vulnerability is coming from. And we'll need to do so moving forward. So we're certainly seeing a renewed emphasis and priority on the homeland defense through the Golden Dome initiative. Slider, is there any loose ends you wanted to tie up here?
Yeah, Lucky, we covered a whole lot. I just want to make sure we don't lose the forest through the trees. And so some of the main
Lots
themes,
of trees up in Canada.
There are a lot, yeah. Some of the highlights we hit today are international partnerships, absolutely essential. And that's for shared intelligence, greater awareness, ability to field more capability against our adversaries. But those relationships, those international relationships are going to form information stovepipes. And so we've got to continue to try to break those down, whether it's across international borders or whether it's within departments within here in the United States. These deliberate efforts are going to be required. We're going to need joint, combined exercises, field shared communication systems, the work of the CDAO. These are all really important efforts. And then finally, given the atrophy of the North Warning System, which we talked about at length, a significant investment is required in new air, land, and space sensors to form this, as Coach put, this layered domain awareness network as we move forward.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I really appreciate your time here today. You know, it's important that we make these investments so that NORAD can do its most important function, track Santa.
I've done it. I assume
the most fun mission.
Yes, I assume you've done that also, Coach, right? Yeah.
I also did that.
He ran it, by the way.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to chatting with y'all later.
Thanks, Lucky.
Thanks, Lucky. This was fun. I'll see you guys next time I'm in DC.
Yeah, you bet.
Sounds great. Thanks, Lucky. See you down the hallway.
And with that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's conversation. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button or follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas that you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on X, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great aerospace power kind of day. See you next time. Did you like that? Do you see how I did that?
I thought you didn't see that one coming.
How could you not? We were talking about the Arctic.
Didn't see that
You
one.
held that, and
great.
it was secret. It was in the sealed envelope she opened up right at the end there.
Well, none of you laughed when I asked coaches, like, so what's on your Christmas list for Santa Claus? I thought that was going to be a dead giveaway.
Gee.
But I got to tell you, I was on that call team. I really enjoyed it. I brought my wife Lisa down there.
So fun, right?
Yeah, it's a
Total
blast.
fun.
So fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that phone ring, how many people, 100 people in there, and that phone rings about as soon as you hang up, the next kid's on the line asking where Santa Claus is. And I really enjoyed your parent support role going there, I can't tell you exactly what time he'll be there, but you should definitely go to bed when your parents say to.
It was funny when I was out there, you could ask for volunteers for cleaning the place up and stuff, and no one would come down. But you ask them to track Santa, and everybody wants to jump in.
That's right.
Pretty good.
That's right.
Well, how many good girls and boys? How many bad girls and boys? They're all good girls and boys, right?
It was hard to tell on the telephone.
You could probably.
If you haven't had a chance to do it, you need to try to figure out how to support that NORAD Track Santa thing. It made Christmas like it was, like I was a kid again. It was just so fun.
That's super. That's good. Cool. All righty, folks.
Okay.
That's a wrap.
Yeah, it was good.
Hey, thanks again,
Hey,
Coach.
Hey,
thanks,
Coach.
Coach.
Good
Nice job.
stuff.